This podcast is brought to you by Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine for those that love to make and drink great beer. Learn more online or subscribe at beerandbrewing.com or find us on social media at Craft Beer Brew. Welcome to the Craft Beer and Brewing Podcast. We are talking remotely with Jaega in London, East London. Welcome to the podcast, Jaega.
Hello. Hello. Thank you for having me.
Jaega is head brewer at Wildcard Brewery in East London. You can also find her on Channel 5's Wine Show from time to time, BBC R4's The Food Program, Beer Masters on Amazon Prime, and she's got a book called Wild Brews that's out June 28th here in the United States. It's great to talk to you, Jaega.
It's also my debut American podcast, so I'm a bit nervous.
It's exciting. You've built a media career in the UK and have helped bring the idea of beer and brewing and that craft approach to making beer out to a broader popular audience. Very cool things that you're doing there, but even there, as you're within your role as head brewer at Wildcard, you're making some creative beers, making a lot of IPA. Apparently, that's what a lot of what the audience wants from you. But you've also been able to carve out some space for fruited beers, wild beers, farmhouse style beers, and even table beers. So we're going to talk about some of those approaches to brewing. You've got a New England style IPA in hand, which I just find mind blowing to see UK breweries making New England style IPAs and then bringing it back. And of course, now doing it with UK hops. We're going to talk about some of those approaches to brewing that you're engaging in. But first, what if you could chill your beer with a more efficient chiller? The answer, G&D Chiller's new micro-channel condensers. G&D's micro-channel condensers are highly efficient in hotter regions, use a fraction of the refrigerant over traditional chillers, which provides less opportunity for leaks, along with lower global warming potential. G&D Chiller's engineers are committed to green technology design while developing a more energy-efficient chiller for the brewing industry. Contact G&D Chillers today at gdchillers.com. Also, this episode is brought to you by BSG and RAR Malting Company, the home of fossil-free malt. RAR's headquarters in Shakopee, Minnesota is powered by renewable electricity. Malt houses and kilns are fed by an electrostatic boiler fueled by agricultural byproducts, much of which is waste from the malting process. By eliminating the use of natural gas, RAR Malting Company reduces CO2 emissions by 260,000 tons per year while filling 25% of the U.S. brewing industry's malt needs. Put the power of RAR malt in your beer at go.bsgcraft.com/contact-us. So, Jaega, we normally start off the podcast talking about your background. So I'm curious, what does that arc through the world of beer look like for you? Where was that moment where you thought, this approach to beer is something I'm very interested in? And then how did that develop into, I need to follow this as a career?
I really wish it was as a romantic. Honestly, it was many, 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 many pints is the honest answer to that question. And then you're like, oh, maybe I could do this for a job. And then you just kind of fall into it, don't you? So I was studying engineering at uni, chemical engineering, all the while, this is in the Midlands in Loughborough, which is next to Nottingham, where I'm from. And the Midlands in the UK is it's like the home of especially like pale cask beer. Lots of mild around there as well. It's down the road from a quite famous place in the UK beerosphere. Do you know Burton-on-Trent? Which is kind of like, it's very famous. So it's just down the road from there. So it's very, very famous for being, for having amazing cask beer. So it's just what you do when you're young. You just hang out in the pub. And I was at uni studying engineering and we were kind of home brewing, and I didn't put the two and two together. It was just something, we used to go to beer festivals all the time and just hang out really. And then fast forward a number of years later, I moved to London. Didn't really have much of a plan. I was working in chemical trading, buying and selling chemicals at the time. I'd done a couple of years working in water treatment, which very handy later, but didn't realize it at the same time. And then I just really didn't like my job. So I quit my job with no plan. got a job in a pub. And then the same friends who I used to hang around with and go to beer festivals with and homebrew with, they were like, you know what, we're thinking of starting a brewery. And I was like, oh, I only had a part-time job in a pub. So I was like, I'll help you. And then it was like, give it here. And then that was it. That was 10 years ago. So it's not a particularly romantic story. And it's just one of those things. The more you're in it, the more you love it. The more you love it, the more you learn about it. And you gain more and more knowledge. And then, it's just to work in beer, to say that you can do it for your job. It's a pretty amazing thing, I think.
Sure. Now, you all built a brewery in a area where, at that point, pub beers are the go-to thing, but you all have struck out with a different beer program. Talk to me about imagining, this different approach to brewing where you are.
Well, I mean, if you look at it, so when we first started in 2012, Wildcard Brewery, that is. So at the time in the capital, there were, I'm talking a couple of years before that, maybe 2010, 2009, there were about 10 breweries in London. So now, as we speak, there are about 110. So that gives you an idea of the growth in a really, really short space of time. So when we first started the brewery, it felt like loads of breweries were opening. That's because they were opening on a weekly basis across the country. So the UK went through a massive beer boom. And it's kind of insane to be around that energy, to be around that excitement. It's quite an inspiring thing to be a part of. And it's quite interesting, even now. So we're seen as like one of the older of the new wave of brewers, which is quite fun. But yeah, so we were brewers from the Midlands. So we were cask brewers. So that's what we did for the first few years. We didn't even have a brewery. We didn't have any money, from quite poor backgrounds in the Midlands. So we started out the first year or so as cookie brewers. So we were brewing on another brewer's kit, buying that, selling it, buying it, selling it. And then we got our bar together, and then we got our bar and our brewery pretty much at the same time. And then it was open top fermentation, 6-barrel kits, lots of casks, lots of bottles. Our first beer was a beer called the Jack of Clubs, which was a ruby red ale. So in hindsight, incredibly traditional in hindsight. But yeah, it's 2022 now.
And then that evolved.
It's 2022 now. Yeah.
Sure.
I mean, it's just the way it is.
Talk to me about that evolution then.
So the evolution really is, so we started out making a ruby red ale. And for most breweries, that is unheard of to make that as your first ever beer. And then we added our Queen of Diamonds IPA, which is very, very popular in East London, incredibly popular. But it was I remember the first batch of it, IBU was way too high. We were cookie brewing it in a place called in a place called Brentwood Brewery in Essex. And in hindsight, I don't know if you know a brewery called Burnt Mill Brewery, but they're quite a well-known brewery here. And it was a lady called Sophie Durand, and she really taught me the physical side of how to brew. This is what you do. This is the kind of stuff you do. You won't read it in any books, but do X, Y, and Z. And yeah, so we did that. Then we were our customers were asking for lager. So okay, got to figure out how to make a lager. So we made some of that. And then it just kind of developed. And then I remember the first conical tank we got. The first conical tank, it was oh my God, eureka moment. So it's always been really interesting. And when you work with open top fermenters, there's always a little bit of exchange with the outside world anyway. So it was kind of an interesting journey, an interesting development. And then we got more conicals, and then we crowdfunded and moved sites. And yeah, so kind of the beers kind of developed quite organically, to be honest.
So nowadays I assume brewing on a much larger system, brewing in what does your typical brew program now look like, and what do you brew the most of? What do people want the most of from you?
So what's really interesting is there's not a huge amount that's changed. So we now brew on a 12-barrel system. It's 100% manual, which is
ouch.
It's challenging. It's really challenging because now it's like half a ton of grain that we need to get in. So it's incredibly challenging. We have a chiller system, a glycol chiller system, so that's automated. But it's a really simple single infusion system. Honestly, it's a lot of fun to brew on. I can make, and I'm sure my German counterparts would argue with me, and probably my American counterparts would argue with me too. But I can make 99.999% on my simple single infusion brew kit. I don't need any bells and whistles. Like, I'm a big believer in you don't need all the fancy equipment to make really great beer. And it's one of the things, so I've recently, and you probably can talk about the book later, but I've recently written a book, and in the book, I just used the boil in a bag, the brew in a bag system. Just like you really, I find it so unnecessary. And one of the things that gets me so irritated is when people put up barriers to other people entering the beer space. Like you really don't need all the bells and whistles. Obviously, it's nice. Of course, I would love to.
Sure.
I would love to have all the bells and whistles, but we all know craft beer. It's a slim margin game, isn't it? So I'm quite happy on my 12-barrel kit and cracking out good beers on it.
You can drive a luxury automobile or you can drive an inexpensive automobile, and they'll both get you to the same place. One may be a little more comfortable and easy to get you there, but they will both get you there. Just, one might take a little more work. Anyway, let's, I want to pivot and talk about some of these beers that you make because, that's what we do right here on the podcast, talk about your approach to, both the creative and the technical processes behind those beers. Before we do that, is your brewery struggling to source or afford berry ingredients? Historic heat waves devastated U.S. berry crops, causing supply to dwindle and prices to skyrocket. That's why brewers are switching over to Old Orchard's craft concentrate blends, which mimic straight concentrates but at a better price point and with a more reliable supply. Is it any surprise that Old Orchard's best sellers are raspberry and blackberry flavors? Reclaim your margins and order your craft concentrates at oldorchard.com/brewer. Also, Arrived mobile point of sale powers places with personality. Arrived is streamlining business operations for the makers of craft with an all-in-one solution that was built with love by hospitality professionals. No contracts and no monthly fees. Make Arrived a no-brainer for your craft business. Go to arrived.com/CBB to set up a free customized demo. That's Arrived, ARRYVED.com/CBB. A different kind of POS has arrived. So, Jaega, let's talk about the beers that you brew now. Like I said at the top, if you look at Untapped, for better or worse, the top 19 of 20 rated beers on Untapped are all IPAs or pale ales and something in that family. So clearly your fans love your hoppy beers. The book that you've written in Wild Brews is about brewing wild, spontaneous, funky farmhouse and fruited beers. The second most checked in beer was a 2.7% table beer. And so you're clearly brewing across the spectrum here, but let's dive into, brewing and talk about your favorite style of beer to brew. What would you consider your favorite?
It's like choosing between my children. I don't have any children.
What's the first of your favorites? What's the first of of your many favorites?
I'll tell you, one of the beers that I do really like are 2.7% table beer. It's gorgeous, and so where we are in London, right? So we have a brewery called the Colonel. I don't know if you've heard of the Colonel, but
sure.
but they are like
I've heard of the Colonel.
They were one of the revolutionaries in the UK. They were one of the first breweries to really do like modern hop forward beers here. And they have a beer called the table beer. And it was very much an argument in the brewery. Like, if we make a beer, only if it is good enough are we allowed to call it that. Because the second you call it table beer, it's automatic comparisons with Colonel. So, I mean, it's a beer we've worked a really long time on. It's a beer that's won us many awards, which is really cool. And it's a beer that's sold really well for us. But just because I love to drink it just because don't forget, over here we drink beers by the pints. And so you want to be on a night out and you want to get into the 6-7 pints drink, if that makes sense. And a table beer allows you to kind of partake in that and do that. So that's one of the beers I really love. It was also it was really difficult to work out the recipe on that one. And I've said it's the recipe.
Let's talk about your approach to this. What are the parameters of this beer?
Okay, so from the top of my head, you asked me a few questions.
How are you fermenting it? How do you build this beer?
Yeah. The thing is, it's the beer I most get asked about commercially, and it's the beer I'll take the recipe to my grave. So I'm not going to tell you the exact details, but it is a beer that is a high starting gravity. It is a high finish gravity on it. We use a particular yeast in order to accommodate that, and then we dry hop it. We double dry hop it. But yeah, no, the grist bill is one that took us a while to work out. I'm normally the least cagey person ever, but this one beer to my grave.
Fair enough. But is this a UK or Belgian style table beer, or is this in that kind of farmhouse tradition, or is
no, it's not
a different approach to table beer?
Yeah, so it's not farmhouse tradition.
Because when we think about table beer here in the US, table beer would probably be assumed to be in that Belgian tradition.
Yeah, so which is perfectly fine. So I mean here, so it's 2.7%, so it's sessionable, the kind of beer you would stick on the table. Here and it can totally mean the kind of more traditional Belgian style, absolutely. But in this instance, it's not. It's very much it's very hazy. It's like a really tiny New England pale, but small. The goal is I don't want anybody to be able to be like, 2.7%. Oh, it tastes like 2.7%. My goal is I want people to think they're drinking a hazy, hoppy, rounded, 4.5% beer. And that's the goal of it. If you can tell it's 2.7%, I've not done my job right.
So this is fascinating then. In the United States, that 4.5% beer would be the session beer, the beer that is much lower alcohol and more drinkable than the other beers. And you are taking it down from there into the 2.7% range with a hazy and hoppy table beer.
Yeah. Well, it's one of the things that when I've traveled to the US, I'm always shocked by how strong everything is. Everything is so strong. But then when I went into a bar and I saw the kind of bar culture is quite different. Number one, the beers are smaller beer, physically. So it's
right.
Correct me if I'm wrong. It's more like schooner size. Is that more correct?
A 12-ounce pour, would be 330 centiliter.
Okay, so okay.
Sorry, 33 centiliter.
33. Okay, so a pint is what, 568 mil. So what's that? 56.8 centiliter, right? So
right.
It's very normal here, especially with cask beer, to drink a lot higher volume but much lower ABV. So when you go to the pub, for example, you'll order a mild. A mild is typically between 3.5% and 4%. But you'll have several of them. It's just I found the difference in drinking culture to be quite large, even though the people in the UK and the US, obviously we speak the same language. It is very, very different in terms of just like pub culture generally and bar culture, which it's absolutely fascinating. But yes, I find the drinks very, very strong in the US.
Well, without giving away all of your secrets on this, building body and building something to support that kind of hoppy flavor and that expression of hops in a beer that small is a challenge that every brewer
absolutely
faces. Are there some techniques or approaches that you take that you could tell me without giving up all of your secrets? That,
I mean,
and how you do that.
I think it's obvious for like professional brewers, and I know lots listen to your show. I mean, it's all about how do you build body? And it's the question all of us are trying to do all the time whenever we make these like thick, juicy beers. And it's the same thing. It's oats, it's wheat, it's high mash temperatures. It's those same techniques. It's not any different. Make sure you get your grain selection. So there's lots and lots of body in there. Make sure you mash in super hot. Obviously, me with my single infusion mash, I'm looking at 69 to 70 degrees. So we're talking about like borderline a problem, right? And we're talking about yeast that will not finish all the way. So you have a nice sweetness. I've pretty much told you. But yeah, so, and then you have to be really, really clean. Because obviously in our brewery, we've got, it's a very simple kit. We don't really get, and with that simplicity, what happens is you don't get a huge amount that goes that wrong, if that makes sense. And every problem I've ever had, I've had it 20 times before. Does that make sense? So it's like almost everything I can solve in like a second. I can think about solving it in a second. But we've also got a canning line, etc. We've got a great canning line from a company who are based in the UK, and just everything has to be just super clean. You don't want any nasties getting in there, basically.
Sure. At that kind of low alcohol level, making sure that hop expression is smooth but also clear is incredibly important. Talk to me about both selecting hop varieties for that kind, that will express well in that kind of beer, as well as any techniques that you use to kind of make sure that those convey in a smooth but also bright way.
You know what was extra challenging? It's not so much the table beer. So over Christmas, this new year, I did a 0.5%, right, beer. And it's really, really similar in technique to the table beer, except it's a little bit even hotter than that in terms of mash. But that was specifically difficult to get the hop expression to be bright and zingy and not overwhelming. Because when we're talking about super low ABV, it pulls the bitterness you get from the hops and especially from the dry hop. And I know everyone says, get dry hop from bitterness. Rubbish. Rubbish. This idea of perceived bitterness is totally, anyway, I digress. But that was particularly difficult to get the balance right, because if you are to dry hop beers that low ABV in the same way you would one with more alcohol to support it, you'd be just way off the mark. Like it has to actually be considerably less hops. And you have to be just cautious about where you use them, when you use them, and going against your instinct and like dry hopping it less. Because the amount of perceived bitterness you pull through at those low ABV levels, especially 0.5%, is considerably higher. So it's certainly a challenge.
So not 0.5. This is what we would consider a non-alcoholic beer.
Absolutely,
if it's below 0.5 ABV.
Absolutely. Yeah.
As we have just tasted a few of those because we're working on our IPA issue right now. And, I can think about that in two ways. Number one, having alcohol improves extraction. Mm-hmm. And so having that much less alcohol could actually inhibit extraction in a bit. But on the flip side, the one thing I've noticed is just how tea-like most of the hop expression gets in beers as they are that low ABV, non-alcoholic ABV. Or, how do you, because without that sweetness or some sort of, more body to that beer, it doesn't help the fruitiness or convey of those kinds of hops. How do you work around that?
It's a challenge. No, it's a real challenge. No, it is. So the beer we made in the New Year's, we were lucky enough to make it in a collaboration with a brewery called Nirvana Brewery, who specialize in alcohol free. So it's one of the great things about beer. Everyone's always learning, right? So anyway, they came, and it was really. They have some very interesting malt techniques. Basically the secret is extremely hot mash. That's the general secret, extremely hot. But like hotter than you would think. You know, the kind of hot that makes you sweat. Oh, I think I'm going to denature everything. Like hotter than that, basically. Then when it came to the hopping, we used our usual hopping technique, but we just pared everything just considerably down. We also made sure that the beer had quite a heavy, I use the word heavy lightly, quite heavy bitterness for a low ABV beer, just because we need some protection in the beer. And when we're talking about 0.5% beer, unfiltered, being made on a 12 barrel scale. So we're talking about a 2,000 litre scale on our canning line in a room where we make beers all the time. We have a bar in there. There's going to be bits in the air. You know what I mean? So we really wanted to make sure that we had that kind of, just the hops in order to give the beer some protection. And then we pared down our dry hop considerably. And then we just did techniques like, normally we would move the beer off the hops into a conditioning tank after we've fermented. So we were really concerned about doing that, just because, and I know everyone cleans their brewery to bits, of course they do, but just the very nature of a 0.5 is quite scary. So we just worked really hard to keep everything contained in primary tank and not move it. Typically we would do inline carbonation, but we chose not to do that. We instead carbonated via top pressure because we're like, it's safer. Even though I am 99.9999999% sure there's nothing in my carb stone, when you're making beers like this, like you have to really bear those things in mind. And then we can. So I don't know. I've lost the question, but that was how we made it. That was how we made it, and it was called the Mosaic IPA, and it was 0.5%, and it was glorious, absolutely glorious.
It's good that you mentioned that. I was having a conversation about that with Bill Schufelt, one of the founders of Athletic Brewing Company, who's a non-alcoholic brewer here in the United States, over at the Craft Brewers Conference. And he was bringing that up, which is a point that I hadn't considered. And it's exactly what you mentioned, that food safety becomes a very big issue, especially with non-alcoholic beers. They don't have the benefit of that alcohol to kill bacteria, potential beer spoilers, and so it's a huge issue.
Yeah, and it's something you have to think about constantly. You have to think about it constantly, like just making sure, okay, especially when you come from a unfiltered kind of side of brewing, like we're not sticking this through filters that will filter out the bacteria or filter out anything else. Like this will go out to the public as is. So, and I think working with haze generally, I think there's good haze and there's bad haze. So we always want it to be on the right side of haze. So just making sure that that's the case. And we don't want to make anyone, food safety is just paramount to making these kind of beers.
There's good haze and there's bad haze. I want to unpack that statement. But before we do, from the rotatable pickup tube on Rogue Brewing's pilot brewhouse to the integrated hopbacks on Sierra Nevada's twin prototyping brewhouses, SS Brewtech has taken the technology they invented, working with world-renowned industry veterans, and made them available to every craft brewer. To learn more about SS Brewtech's innovation list, head on over to ssbrewtech.com. So UK brewers for a long time were using all of these yeasts that American brewers making hazy IPA eventually discovered, where they could make them this hazy. Now, of course, most UK brewers were not trying to make those beers hazy. They were trying to make bright beers and, using techniques to then to clarify those beers. Talk to me about this idea now that there's good haze and bad haze.
Absolutely. So the kind of haze that you get when you've messed up a mash. Don't forget, my kit is 100% manual. So it's very, very independent on the skill of the individual brewer that's working that day. So it's like, it's my job to make sure that we're all doing exactly the same thing over and over and over again. But if someone does something stupid, like let a load of malt into the kettle, bad haze. You know what I mean. If the person who's running the canning line, if there's loads of yeast going into package, bad haze. You know what I mean? You want a nice hop haze is lovely. You can usually tell the difference physically, visually. I don't want chunks in my beer. I don't want physical leaves in my beer.
Right.
I don't want to be on the toilet after I drink my beer because you've left too much yeast in package. So it's about getting that balance right. And that balance at times can be tricky, especially when we're fighting against our good old friend gravity, who wants to pull a beer bright constantly. So it is incredibly challenging to get a stable haze, one that will last the entire shelf life of the beer. And it's something that comes with practice, and it's something that comes with time, something that comes with knowing your yeast selections and your yeast combinations. I'm a big fan of blending yeasts. I use this yeast for this personality trait. I use this yeast for this personality trait. You know what it's like. I mean, you work in beer. You know what it's like. You just get to know the ingredients you're working with. You get to know the materials you're working with. You get to know their yeast, their personalities, their likes, their dislikes. The same with all of your ingredients across the board. And just like playing with them and stretching them and seeing how far you can push them. And sometimes that was too far. And then you have to wind back a bit, but it's a lot of fun, and it's largely a trial and error process, really.
Sure. No, the goal is what these, protein polyphenol complexes that, are small enough to stay in solution within these beers. You mentioned.
I think largely, you know what it comes down to largely. I think when you look at a beer, and like we spend a lot of time like talking about it and analyzing it and getting educated to the highest of degrees about it and all this sort of stuff and all your ingredients and all the latest stuff that's happening around the world. I think the fundamental question has to be, does this taste nice? I think that's the fundamental question when we make anything. Does this look nice? Is this appealing to my eyes? So the kind of haze that is inviting, is welcoming, that makes you want to pick it up, that kind of golden hue, that's what you want. The kind of dirty brown or like grayish haze that it's not an inviting thing to consume. So, I mean, does it taste nice? I think that probably leads my brewing in every which way. But there you go.
But making that attractive haze, I imagine, involves two things. Number one, selecting the right kind of malt, so that it will look attractive there. And, I imagine it also involves controlling oxygen through the brewing process, so that, you're not dulling down the color of that. What are some of those, processes that you use and some of those levers that you pull to make sure that even if it is hazy, that it's a very attractive haze?
So we're very lucky over here that we have quite incredible maltsters over here. So dare I say, some of the best in the world. Cheeky comment. I know I'm doing fighting talk.
I would expect you to support your home team.
So, I mean, a lot of problems can be avoided by simply working with a reputable maltster. So someone you work with, someone you trust. When you have issues, and you do, and every brewer knows, like seasonally, you do have issues at certain times of the year. So here we tend to get malt tends to go a bit funny around about January time over here. So just kind of keep just being seasonal and like looking at what's going on, looking at what's in the market, looking at the players, and really knowing your maltster. I think the other thing is, of course, oxygen. Absolutely oxygen. So one of the things that we spent our money on basically is we bought an Anton Par machine. So the Anton Par machine tells us our dissolved oxygen, and it tells us our CO2 levels. And that is the machine that is probably the workhorse of the brewery. It gets the most yeast. So our goal, no matter what we're doing, is to get obviously as low oxygen pickup as possible before it goes into cans, so in tank, just making sure everything is where it needs to be with regards to that. And I think that simple piece of equipment has probably made the biggest difference to the whole brewery, and making sure the output is quality. But I'm going to say a but on this. For a number of years, we didn't have an Anton Par or money for that. And I think the skills of like knowing how and when something is carbonated without machinery, I think is something can often be overlooked. And just knowing just the feel of it, the look of it, like how the bubbles are, how tight they are, how loose they are, to kind of being able to gauge whether that beer is where it needs to be, I think is important. You can do a huge amount without equipment, but having an Anton Par has been the best thing I ever did. It's amazing. I love it.
Sure.
But yes, no, all the things you're talking about.
Absolutely. I love watching brewer Instagram accounts where they're posting readings off of their Anton Par machines of dissolved oxygen. It's one of the best uses of social media that I've found so far.
You know what? I've never done it actually, but I probably have some for a few on there actually. But you know what it is? It's like sometimes you're just so proud. Like, I mean, you know, like, I think we got like 4 ppb of like dissolved oxygen, and we were all like just so proud. And that message went around the brew team, only the brew team, because no one else in the team gives a toss. But it goes around the brew team. Like, will the public care? I don't know. I don't know that they would, or it'd be our most liked post, but it's something we care about.
At least your brewer friends would also understand.
True.
Well, you mentioned earlier that you love to co-pitch different yeasts, multiple yeasts when you're brewing this. And again, I didn't expect for us to talk about pale ale as long as we have on this podcast, but it's interesting to get this perspective from you on this. Talk to me about your approach to co-pitching, pitching together multiple yeasts in these beers.
Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. I've learned the hard way when it doesn't. But there are some combinations that I just really, really love. One of them, so I'm talking specifically from like a dried perspective. So you can pitch together the New England and Windsor yeast, works really, really well. You can pitch together. I tell you what doesn't.
You're using dried yeasts? I'm
talking about dried yeast here. You can pitch together. Okay. I'm trying to think. I've tried so many over the years, and what I'm mainly looking for is characteristics that I'm looking for from one yeast and another, and seeing if I can get them to work in unison, and seeing if I can get the benefits of both of those. Yeah, it's really quite straightforward.
Which combinations, which have worked and which have not worked?
I'll tell you which doesn't work well together. USO5 and the New England yeast. So the Lallemand New England yeast, terrible combination. Because what happened is the Lallemand New England, if anyone's ever worked with it, terrible lag phase, absolutely awful. Can take like up to 48 hours to like get its act together and like start munching on some sugar, right? And then you have USO5. Again, USO5 is not the fastest yeast, but it does the job cleanly, right? But there are other yeasts. If you want to get if you want to get it going quickly, there are other yeasts that will do a better job. So the USO5 kicks off and does its work, and the New England yeast really, really struggles behind it. And almost every time we brewed with it, and I made a beer with it where I had to make, you make a beer, it tastes delicious, you sell it to a customer, the customer says, oh, I'll have X amount of that. And you're like, oh, okay, that one-off brew, okay, fantastic. And then suddenly you have to make it 20 times in a row. And we discovered that problem on with that yeast combination on our 20 times. I think it was like brew number 15 or something, where we were getting continuous stuck ferments. But yeah, no, they're not friends. But you just learn from experience. And some yeast combos are nice, some yeast combos aren't. So some brewers may not do this at all, and they may think I'm talking out of my backside, but it's a lot of fun, and just kind of play with their personalities and see what comes out.
How do you manage then repitching within the commercial brew house, especially when you are blending yeast like that? Do you then start fresh, with each batch, because they'll work at different phases? One will outcompete the other generally, and after multiple generations, it's a different balance and won't operate the same kind of way. How do you manage around that?
Yeah, I honestly don't do a huge amount of repitching in our brewery. So we don't have a yeast lab set up in our brewery. So the constraints that we have within the setup that we have is that's not something that we currently do. It's something that we'll be doing within the next 6 to 8 months, I'm going to say. But for us, it's a massive, massive cost saving, potentially, obviously. So ask me again in 6 to 8 months, and I'll answer that question for you.
Sounds fair. Well, let's change subjects here and talk about brewing wild and funky and farmhouse and fruited beers. Certainly that's the subject of the book that you've just written, and it's something that obviously the topic is of interest to you. You make fruited beers across the sour spectrum, longer sour beers as well as shorter production sour beers, more kettle sour approach or quick soured approaches. Talk to me about how you've structured this kind of wild approach, to brewing, and what you find yourself drawn to and some of the ways that you've chosen to make some of those beers.
So I'm very lucky, and I think we're very lucky here in the UK in that we are just down the road from Belgium. So for us, it is literally...
Well, across a channel, but yes. I guess you can take a train there. You're right.
This is what I was going to say. Like, no one's getting across everyone's going on the train to Belgium. Yeah. So it's literally, you go to King's Cross, and where the brewery is, in Walthamstow, we are 12 minutes to King's Cross on the tube, right? So you go to King's Cross. Admittedly, it's a lot harder since Brexit. I'm not gonna lie. But anyway, you get on the train and you're in Belgium, and they make the best sour beers. They make the best wild beers, the best funky beers in the entire globe. So to even have them as neighbors, and to even have them as close, I'm aware of just how in awe and how lucky we are here. So with regards to the book, the whole idea of the book was making wild beers from beginner to expert. That was kind of my tagline. And it was the journey that I set out on when I first started making these beers. There's so much information you need to know. There's so much practical information you need to know. And it's quite hard to find it all in one place. So I decided to write the book that I would have wanted to read when I started out in this journey. And it's geared towards homebrewers. So there's a whole homebrewing section in there that talks about different recipes and how to make these beers with your brew in a bag method and what have you. But I've spent a huge amount of time working with wood. What happens when you get a barrel that's in terrible condition, practically, like, what do you do day one? Like, what chemical combination do you use to bring that back? I've spent a lot of time talking about fruit. I spent a huge amount of time working with lots of different fruits. And my general my general opinion of just working with fruits generally is just they all have their own. I'm going to use the word personality again. They all have their own ways they like to be worked. They all have their own pHs they like to express themselves best at, and the way you figure this out is by doing it. The way you figure out dosing rates is by doing it. So hopefully I've put some dosing rates in there as well. I spend a huge amount of time talking about water. Here, I'm in London. We have the most high alkalinity water. It's just shocking to work with. To try and make a lager with this water is just horrible. There's not many books out there from a UK perspective that has, okay, if you're in London, your water looks like this. If you're in Cornwall, if you're in Scotland, your water probably looks like this. And these are the steps you need to be taking. So that was kind of the focus. I spent a lot of time talking about dry hopping and different dry hopping techniques, because we talk a lot about Kveik beers in the book as well. So yeah, it's just, and obviously we're down the road from bloody Belgium, so where they make Gurzes and they make lambics and they make lambics Gurzes, where they make just amazing things. So I am 4 years into my own program. I've got some released on the market. So I've got our Cuvée Saison that's been released in the market, which is being received amazingly. And I have got all of my Gurzes, which has been aged 3 different years. So 3 year, 2 year, 1 year. Sure. With a fresh, sprightly little thing blended in as well. Also, 2018, which in the UK was like the best year ever for grapes. I had half a Walthamstow calling me saying, Jaega, I've got some grapes. Do you want them? And I was like, I don't know what I'm going to do with them, but I'll take them. So I made some wine, and some of the Gers has been sat on the wine as well. So it's E17, so London grown grapes in Rioja barrels, has been aged for a long time, has been bottled. They're in champagne bottles. They've been in bottles for the last, must be the last 8 months or so. So I'm just kind of waiting. I'm holding my, I'm like waiting to drop that on the market. But our Cuvée Saison has just dropped. I make a lot of Saisons as well.
Let's talk about that Cuvée.
Yeah.
Let's talk about that Cuvée Saison. What is your general approach to that beer? Are you modeling it after, some archetypes within that? And then, is this a mixed fermentation Saison with a culture with Brettanomyces as well as Saccharomyces and maybe other things? Then, if it is, how do you approach that, and how have you built that culture in order to make this beer in an ongoing way? Yeah.
So this beer particularly, what's interesting about this beer, the Cuvée Saison. So this is a beer that was actually made to be the young, sprightly blend to go into the several years of lambics I had, basically. And this beer tasted so good on its own that we've released it on its own. So this is on paper, this is a mixed fermentation beer, and it is a saison based. It's incredibly sour, so it's soured beautifully, and to say it's gorgeous is an understatement.
What is your acidity goal?
Acidity goal, always
either titratable acidity or pH.
3.1, always. And it's a bugger because it lies to you. Never go off taste. I always test it. Never ever go off taste. It lies to you. On all my sours, it's always 3.1. The last thing I ever want to hear from anybody is, it's not sour enough.
So what is it about 3.1 versus 3.2, 3.3? Obviously, this is a logarithmic scale, and so 3.1 is rather acidic.
It is rather acidic, but I'm not talking about the Cuvée. So that gets to what it gets to. It's mixed ferm. It is it's its own beast. I'm talking about kettle sours, fruit sours. It's typically my goal to get it down to 3.1. I find a bit higher than that, it can be a little bit flabby. But as I said before, each fruit has its own little personality, doesn't it? So working with the acidity that comes from the fruit as well, I think is super important, and bearing that in mind. So we do a lime Berliner Weiss. And that is obviously just huge amounts of acidity that comes from the lime. And like making that work with like a lactic based acidity is like a lot of work. It's a lot of work. And making sure that that acid is under control is also a lot of work. But I mean, these beers are so unbelievably fun. And working with goses, and like we make a lot of goses. So our passion fruit gose is probably our best selling in terms of in the sour space. Like I make a huge amount of it. And with that, you have to work with salt and making sure the salt expresses itself. And I always say if a gose tastes salty, there's too much salt. But how do you know how much salt to add into a gose? So it's just something that we've been working on for a long time. I've been making that beer for a long time. But again, it all started at homebrew level. Like the passion fruit gose is a homebrew beer that I made at homebrew and then and scaled up commercially.
How do you work as you are thinking about this quick sour method using fruit in those that has differing acidities within that fruit? How do you, are you working on a kind of calculation process? Are you, what are you blending different amounts of these things? You're blending not just acidity, but also fruit flavor and trying to achieve that. Of course, pH can impact the expression of that fruit flavor itself, and should be in a specific pH area in order to convey and be able to be read on the palate as that fruit.
I think it's a mixture. It's a mixture of, I'm now opening our oaf juice, which is our berry sour, as we're talking about this, because I feel like it's fitting. So honestly, it's a mixture of all of the above. When I first started working with lots of these fruits, I spent a huge amount of time on their spec sheet and spent a huge amount of time of how much sugar they contained. So obviously when you're making these beers, one of the most important things is to make sure they ferment out. I know in America you guys do things a bit differently, but here, like, there's no cold. There's no. I know. I'm just saying. I've heard the stories. I've seen the Instagrams of the exploding cans and like keep cold and all that sort of stuff. Here, there's no cold chain distribution, so I have to expect my beer to sit on a warm ash shelf for 22, 23 degrees Celsius and be okay. So, I mean, it's one of the things that I have to work on when I'm working with fruit sours is making sure that the yeast has enough contact time in order to be able to really, really munch down on those sugars, really.
What form do you tend to use fruit in? Are you using puree? Are you using juice concentrate? Are you using whole fruit? And does that vary based on which fruit you're talking about?
Yes, and it depends on availability. So some fruits are better on expressing themselves than others. And some you may use in combination with an essence, for example. Like, I'm not a big fan of essences. It's not something that I choose to brew with. It's not something that I choose to put in my beers. But a really good example is like blueberry, for example. Blueberry looks fantastic when you're working with it. If you get a blueberry puree, for example, and you add that in the tail end of fermentation, it will look fantastic. It will not smell like blueberry at all. So in order to overcome that, you probably do have to add an aroma in there as well in order to work with that particular fruit. I'm not a fan of that. So my dissertation when I was at uni was, it sounds really silly, but it was the concentration of fruit juices, right? And it sounds like really silly and really basic, but it's very complicated in how they make make concentrate fruit juice and how they remove aromas from fruits because they are so volatile and they dissipate so easily. And the different tricks they use, etc., etc. It's not something that I choose to work with if I can avoid it. So I like to work with fruits that are very expressive. One of them is raspberry, obviously. That's incredibly expressive. How much raspberry to dose? That's something that you can probably talk to your friends, talk to the brewers, have a look at different beers you like. But nothing really trumps personal experience and doing it on a homebrew scale and seeing how it presents itself. And the other thing is by physically just trying it, seeing what happens. Like you're working with it on a special, try it, but do it in a way where there's a window to fix it if you do it wrong. I think is important. So kind of dose day by day, if that makes sense. So I do a lot of that. Working with passion fruit is one.
When you say that, what is that process? What does that process look like then? If you are adding and then adding again, are you just pumping into your conical fermenter as it's fermenting? Because clearly you want still some active yeast in there to ferment this back out.
So I'm talking a few points from end of fermentation. That's when I dose my fruit. So I'm talking maybe 2 or 3 points. So I've still got activity in the beer, but I'm not producing like bucket loads of like CO2, and that's when I tend to add. And then if you catch it the next day, so basically have a taste of it before. Make sure you take your pHs, your gravities, your all the tests you need to do. And then the next day when you get to it, chances are it will probably be on the very tail end of fermentation again. Right? Have a taste of it. If it's not dosed enough, give it a mix. If it still doesn't taste like there's enough fruit in it, add some more. So, and you can do that on a bag by bag basis, and it depends obviously on how much time you have. Sometimes in a commercial brewery, we all have deadlines, but especially when you're working with new fruit, I think finding where their natural zone is, where that tastes like raspberry. That's kind of a sweet spot where you don't want to add too much because you want to save money commercially. We all know raspberries not cheap. Passion fruit, incredibly expensive. But also like you need that fruit to express itself. So I pretty much have a pretty solid like dosing fruit technique that I don't really vary from that much. But the tricky thing is always working with new fruits. So I worked with damson for the first time on a kind of kettle sour base, and just an absolutely incredibly tricky to get right, because damson, I don't know if you've had a lot of damson before.
I'm not familiar with that. What is damson?
It's like a dark plum. It's similar to plum, but it's not as expressive as a plum. So in itself, it's just not very tart. It's not a very tart fruit, but you get lots of like, it's very, very British actually. You get lots of damson jam, and it's essentially like a teeny weeny little purple tiny plum basically. I'm sure lots of people in the UK will be like, that's not what a damson is, but I think that explains it pretty well. Between a plum and a blueberry. Yeah, okay, that's probably better. But it's not very tart at all. But it's very flavoursome, but not very tart. So it's how do you work with this particular fruit that you want to get the flavour, but you're not going to get a huge amount of acidity. And with that one, and I held it back from release when it was due to be released. And I was like, guys, this is not taste. This is not good enough. So with that, we did a lot of, because I had a certain amount of damson, and I was going to use damson for something else, and I just kept tasting it like, no, it needs more. No, it needs more. No, it needs more. Until I have that fruit really expressing itself. The other one's really hard. Hibiscus. I don't know if you've worked with it before.
Not personally, but I have some brewer friends who are huge fanatics.
So in terms of, so my family are from the Caribbean, like a place called Trinidad and Tobago, and there's a very popular drink called sorrel, and sorrel and hibiscus are pretty much the same thing. Well, they are the same thing, and in different parts of the world, you see that particular flower being called different things. So lots of people from the Caribbean community, if you say you've made something with sorrel, that is like, oh my God, I must get my hands on it, basically. So we have lots of sorrel in the brewery, and I've only ever drank it kind of with my families, with my relatives, with a load of sugar in it. It's incredibly sweet, and it's not naturally so. Literally spoonfuls of sugar are added to this this sorrel drink. So to work with this flower that I know very well, my family knows very well, my family's family knows very well, and not be able to use sugar is incredibly challenging. And I learned some things about it. Like it's insanely tart. It's tart in a way that's quite incredible. And it's tart in a very different way to a lactic sourness. It's a very different way to lots of other kinds of sourness, but it's incredibly hard to work with. It's also a natural indicator. So if anyone wants to work with hibiscus, what happens is when you caustic the tank, afterwards, it goes lots and lots of funny colors, which is really cool. But yeah, no, I mean, I think with all these things, it's
with
trial
an
and
ingredient
error.
like that, yeah, there's a chance of astringency, that it can take on a kind of tea-like tannic character.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And also working with that as well, because if you add too much, you're exactly right. You get this like tannic quality, which is too far. And I always say when working with any fruit, work with it on its own and just see how it behaves, see how it performs before just blending it with anything else. So the one I'm drinking right now, so this is a combination of raspberry, blackcurrant, and sorrel. And this is something like I make raspberry goses, I make blackcurrant goses, I've made hibiscus saisons or sorrel saisons. Like I've worked with the fruits for years on their own before I'm brave enough to know, okay, well, I'm going to get this quality from that, I'm going to get that quality from that. But with all these things, I'm a massive, massive fan of just have a go, just do it and see what happens. You can always fix it mid-ferment or late ferment. You can always fix it.
Sure. Well, let's zoom out a little bit here as we finish and talk about what the future holds for Wildcard and what the future holds for you. What's on the horizon? Where do you see the brewery going, and what are you most excited about in the short term and long term?
So lots has been happening at the brewery. So we were lucky enough to win. A few, a number of awards recently. So we won a gold in the European Beer Challenge, in the New England category. So New England IPA. So across, you can imagine across Europe, that's really cool. But even cooler than that was our Cuvée Saison won a silver, and you can imagine European Beer Challenge. It's full of all the Belgian brewers. So for that is like, it's like pinnacle. We have got our barrel store, which is our site the other side of Walthamstow, and it's got our barrel wall up, and it's all full of lots of lovely beer, which we put in a huge difficulty about 2 weeks ago, because we took the barrels out, we emptied them, we've bottled them, we've refilled them, we've put them up, but trying to get up lots of barrels that have actual beer in it in a certain order up on a wall in a live bar, that's a challenge. So I don't know if you've seen my show Beer Masters.
I have not watched the show, but it's on my Amazon. I guess I am an Amazon member, so I avoided it for so long to try to stick with local business, and I did eventually cave. I still do have that membership.
Well, I'm going to tell everyone listening to the podcast, please watch Amazon Prime's Beer Masters, it's a homebrew competition show, and please help a girl out. I need my viewing figures to be decent. So and please review it and say nice things. But that's just a show where we travel around Europe, and it's a homebrewing competition essentially. So please watch that. And obviously the book is coming out in the US soon, so I'm really excited about that. I'm excited to hear what all the home brewers and the professional brewers all think about that. Hopefully, I think my biggest goal for the book was I want to make a book that's useful and that's worth being on a brewer's shelf. So I've spent a lot of time talking about like off flavors and why they happen, and not only why they happen, how to fix them if they happen. Because I know us like professionally, that's what we do all the time, is you taste things all the time, and there may be a problem here, there may be a problem there. As you said, it's all problem solving, and it's about like, what do I physically do when this happens? I don't want to talk verbatim. I don't want to talk theoretic. Well, I do want to talk theoretically, but I want to know like tomorrow, like what do I do? So, I mean, I've spent a lot of time talking about that in the book. So hopefully it's worthy of a place in brewers' shelves, I think, was the plan.
It's a beautifully constructed book and, full of high quality content that everyone should go out and buy, of course. And on that note, I think we should bring this to a close. G&D's microchannel condensers are highly efficient in hotter regions. BSG and Rahr Malting Company are the home of fossil-free malt. Get reliable supply for your fruit beers with Old Orchard's craft concentrate blends. Arrived mobile point of sale powers places with personality, and put SS Brewtech's advances to work in your brew house. Of course, your magazine subscription directly supports our ability to bring you this podcast each week. Go to beerandbrewing.com, click on that subscribe button. Let us know that this content matters to you. And then, of course, go out and buy Jaega's book. Jaega, if people want to learn more about you, what you do, where to find your book, all of these other things, Wildcard Brewery, where do they find you out there on the internet and in real life?
So on the internet, so I'm on all the socials, so at JaegaWise and at Wildcard Brewery on across all socials as well. And our website, the usual places.
Of course. Well, I appreciate you talking with me about brewing today on the podcast. Cheers.
Cheers.
This podcast is brought to you by Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine, for those that love to make and drink great beer. Learn more online or subscribe at beerandbrewing.com, or find us on social media at Craft Beer Brew.